Hello, everybody. My name's Stephen Millard from Notion Capital, and welcome to the second in our series of presentations on the 1 to 100 million journey. In the first session, I talked quite a lot of detail about the data that underpins much of what we're going to be describing. So if you want to dig into more detail on that, you can find the information on the website. I'll be touching on a little bit of it here. But I went into more depth previously. In this topic, we're going to be really taking a bit of a step back on the 100 million journey and talking about the profound differences of the start, build, and scale story. I'll start off with a little bit of the data, though. So this is the starting point, obviously, of the pretty much every VC-backed SaaS company, that every VC-backed SaaS company must have a credible pathway to 100 million in revenue at the point at which we're coming together and saying, yes, we want to invest. That's one of the most important questions we ask ourselves, and we want founders to ask themselves as well. But I think it's important to put that in the context of history, if you like. They said, well, how likely is that? That's a question that's intrigued me for quite a while, and I went down a bit of a rabbit hole looking for this kind of data, and was very well supported by a number of people in terms of pulling this together. And so what I'll just briefly describe here is the analysis we're showing, which is we look back to 2005 through to the end of 2022, and we pulled a data set of every SaaS and cloud company that was founded around the world. It's about 120,000 companies. Of those, we know that around about a third, 37,000, are VC backed. So they raised an amount of money that's less than 3 million, because then what we then filtered down to is the 13,789 who raised more than 3 million in venture capital, which back in 2005 might have equated to a Series A, and today clearly not, but nevertheless it gives us a yardstick. What we see from that 13,789 is that just under 2% of those companies have achieved 100 million in ARR, a 1 billion IPO or $1 billion acquisition. So it's 1.8%, 243 out of 13,789. So that's a 1 in 50. And I don't think that's necessarily surprising. What is surprising is when we kind of take it down another level. Yeah, what's really interesting is that, so that's 243 companies, all achieved an outstanding outcome, 100 million revenue or $1 billion realization, let's call it that. What's really interesting is that of that 243, only 168 actually achieved 100 million in revenue. So that's 1.2%. That's 1 in 100. Now, don't get me wrong, achieving 100 million in revenue is an extraordinary outcome, no matter how long it takes. But what's even more extraordinary is 20% of those companies achieved 100 million in less than 6 years, which is, quite honestly, quite an elite undertaking. The median is 9 years. And then the other interesting thing to take from this is that 65% of these companies reach 100 million revenue in less than 10 years. And what we can see from the data is that it seems to become less likely that they will achieve 100 million in revenue after 10 years rather than more. And I think there's a couple of reasons we could postulate for that. One is some kind of founder fatigue kicks in. Two might be pressure from shareholders and stakeholders. But I think also, what we need to recognize is that technological obsolescence kind of kicks in. Technical debt kicks in, and increased competition kicks in. And so it really focuses the mind in terms of saying, if we want to achieve that kind of outcome, we need to move fast in order to realize our potential, or somebody else will. The 10 years is obviously important from a VC perspective, because that's the typical length of a venture fund, right? And so when we invest in a company, we have an absolute maximum of 10 years before the end of the fund in which we want to see some kind of realization. And, I think that is an important topic of conversation that we should always be having with between founders and VCs that says, we do have a timeline. And I think the other thing that's very interesting is I'm always kind of slightly persuaded by the saying, and I don't know who penned this first. I've heard it associated with Bill Gates and many others, that we all underestimate what we can achieve. We all overestimate what we can achieve in a year, but we hugely underestimate what we can achieve in a decade. And I think that's incredibly powerful to always keep that in mind. So if we take the top level and we say 1% achieve 100 million in revenue, and a maximum of 2% will achieve 100 million revenue or a realization, and that's looking backwards over almost 20 years worth of data, then what we can also say is that 98% don't. And that's really interesting. And I think really kind of focuses the mind into saying, well, why and what happens to the other 98%? Andy Lever, who was one of the operating partners at Notion, he really turned me on to this idea of what he calls the rule of ones and threes, which is that companies get stuck at very similar revenue milestones: 1 million, 3 million, 10 million, 30 million, 100 million, and so on and so forth. It's a simple kind of way of thinking about things, but it's very powerful because typically those revenue milestones relate to specific outcomes that a company needs to achieve, which might be finding product market fit, starting to move beyond product market fit to establish go-to-market fit, to move beyond go-to-market fit to scale-to-market fit. And what we see from looking at the market and also looking at our own portfolio is that typically 20% of VC-backed companies really never get off the ground. They never achieve much more than $1 million in ARR, so they don't find product market fit. 40% don't manage to translate the early promise into something even moderately repeatable. They never get beyond founder-led sales, and 40% never get past 3 million. 60% then never get past the 3 to 10. And the 3 to 10, I think, is the really critical stage, which is the founder privilege is starting to erode, and we need to start to establish a very repeatable, professionalized, specialized go-to-market function, which is aligned to our product, our proposition, and our customers. And 60% never get past there. 80% never get past 30 million. They haven't turned that initial go-to-market model into something repeatable. And of the 20% who do get past 30 million, we see a very small number that then get to 100 million. It's probably 10% of the 20%, because there are major challenges along the way. And this quote from Andy at the bottom, I think, is really pertinent. A big part of the journey and the recognition that founders need to have is that the things that make a company successful at each revenue milestone, that they'll not only not make them successful at the next stage, they'll make them unsuccessful at the next stage. We simplify this down to kind of 3 specific life stages: start, build, and scale, that relate very specifically to product market fit, go-to-market fit, and scale-to-market fit. People can fall into the trap of thinking that the startup journey is a continuum. I raise the seed and then the Series A, and I progress on a linear basis through to real scale. And that's simply not the case. There are profound differences along the way that are encapsulated by these revenue milestones and by this fundamental philosophy of start, build, and scale. And that's what I'm going to be spending the next 20 minutes or so just diving into. So start, build, and scale is designed to cut through that noise. The start is all about that extraordinary time period where a group of exceptional people come together to establish whether there is a really meaningful problem to solve. It is that kind of classic, crazy kind of startup where everybody's a generalist, everybody's heads down, everybody is trying to prove that there's a really meaningful problem and a very substantial opportunity. The build phase is profoundly different. So if I get successfully through the start phase, then the build phase is really about architecting growth. That 3 to 10, 10 to 30 is where the majority of the failure occurs. If we assume that we found product market fit, then and many reasons might dictate why we don't, and come out of the start phase with a real clarity of focus, then failure in the build phase is down to our inability to really professionalize and specialize across the go-to-market function and across many other parts of the business as well. The scale phase is really about then translating the go-to-market model into something that is like a growth machine, if you like. I'm looking down on it and I'm unable to tune every single aspect of that machine to ensure that it hums and really scales into new product sets, into new geographies, into new markets. These profoundly different stages are really important to understand because they dictate not only what we do, but also who we hire and what really matters to us. So I'm going to break those stages down into a little bit more detail. I like start, build and scale because they describe the fundamental differences of those periods, and they can be used as kind of verbs and also nouns. So I'm starting a business and I'm just figuring everything out, but also the people are starters. They're the pioneers. They're everybody huddled around. I mean, I love this quote from Doug. You know, it's that idea that somebody's just dumped a jigsaw puzzle on the floor, 1,000 pieces. The pieces are everywhere. They've thrown away the box, and everybody's trying to figure out, well, is there you know, can we find the corners? Can we find the edges? Can we actually come together to solve this problem? And the startup phase is this starting phase is a bit like that, and the people in the start phase are a bit like that. They're all excellent, of course, but they're generalists. We distinguish the start phase into two stages. One stage, two phases, I should say. So 0 to 1 is about building the MVP. It's about establishing a product that customers will buy and use. And I think one thing to just call out, I mean, I think this is true all the way through the journey, is that we sometimes underestimate the importance of success in the go-to-market model. So I want to emphasize that the use the product and extract value is as important, if not more, than the buying process. In the 1 to 3, then what we're really starting to do is to uncover that go-to-market model. That's dictated by the problem I'm solving, the customers I'm serving, the product I'm building, and creating a go-to-market that is as unique as those aspects that's right for me and my business, and importantly, starting to move beyond founder-led sales. There are 5 principles for us that underpin the start phase. The first one of these is that we have to stay narrow and focused, and we need to zero in on a core set of customers. Maybe it's 20, 30, as we've got on the right-hand side here from Nick. The core set of customers that are buying and experiencing value in a very, very similar way. Same customers, same use cases. They're generalized to a very, very large market. There's a lovely quote here from Nick when I was talking. Nick Mehta, who's the CEO of Gainsight, not one of our portfolio, unfortunately, but an extraordinary great ally to me and to our portfolio, who said this to me: if I had my time over, I'd spend as long as it takes at this stage until I had 30 plus customers who were all advocates for me, who generalized to a very large market. He kind of distilled it even further. Customers that generalize, humans that advocate. The second thing I need is a sellable product. And that is, I think, a really difficult challenge to overcome, which is, this is the essence of a product that we can actually serve to customers on a repeatable basis and use that to establish that emerging go-to-market model. The third thing is, I have to have customers experiencing value in very, very similar ways. And I need to be able to evidence that in terms of experiential and emotional value, but rational quantitative value as well. The fourth thing is, I need to start laying the groundwork for a transferable sales process. So we can fall into the trap of thinking that selling, as the founder, is the be-all and end-all. And I, as the founder, can do that. But my job as a founder isn't just to sell, it's also to start to lay the groundwork for that very transferable sales process, going down to that almost atomic level. I'll touch on that in a second. And the last is customers advocating for you. I think about SaaS as a machine. We talked about just earlier, everything needs to interrelate. But let's just keep this really simple. I want to win some ideal customers. I want to make them insanely successful. And I want to close that loop. So these 5 things, I think, are the very, very essence of the start phase that encapsulates both product market fit and moving beyond founder-led sales. And, speaking for myself, if I was had my time again setting up another company, if I was cautious with my capital, I really wouldn't care how long it would take to get to that first million of ARR. There are great examples. If you look at a Snowflake or you look at a Figma, the time period from founding to the first meaningful revenue could be quite substantial, 4 or 5 years. But then I've really nailed it. I'd want everything to be as perfect as possible, the ideal customers, the ideal use cases, and a massive opportunity, and then look to move rapidly through the build phase. And we'll be touching on that a little bit more in the next section. So, building and builders, again, using, the verb and the noun. We rightly romanticize the start phase. Thousands and thousands of companies, entrepreneurs establishing businesses. It's such an exciting time period that any of us have gone through. And then we laud the centaurs and the extraordinary companies, like the Snowflakes or the Atlassians or the Figma, or in our portfolio, the Muse or the Go Cardless or the Paddle. But the build phase is where it's really at. This is the hard yards. This is where the greatest amount of, not failure, but lost value, lost time, because this is a big shift. This is shifting gears from, chaos to order. So if I use my analogy of the jigsaw puzzle, hey, all of a sudden we've got a picture. And that really helps when you're doing a big jigsaw puzzle. We see the business going through 2, again, phases, 1 stage, 2 phases. From 3 to 10 million, we have to start to establish the go-to-market model. The go-to-market model that's right for us. I'll talk about in another session some of the mistakes that undermine, I should say, failure. And one of them in this stage, I think, is the assumption that a playbook that works in another industry or another company, or the executive I hire who has a rinse and repeat playbook, that it'll work for me. It might, but it probably won't. we need to be thinking about our go-to-market model from first principles. And we need to be building that with professionals and specialists who can translate that chaos into order and establish repeatability across the demand creation, sales conversions, and revenue realization. From 10 to 30, your go-to-market playbook starts to develop and harden. We need to have a really well-defined playbook that encompasses the entire customer lifecycle, backed up by robust processes, systems, and data. So you can tell just from the language that we're using here that these stages, again, are quite different. We work a lot with Rachel Turner, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, who's the author of the Founder's Survival Handbook. And she analogizes the life stages of the startup journey to the role that the CEO needs to manifest. And the best founders and CEOs can transition between one and the other at different times of the life cycle. So the start phase is predominantly that the CEO and founder is the fearless warrior. They're leading from the front. They are doing whatever it takes. But during this phase, that fearless warrior needs to become a considered architect. And that's a very, very difficult change to overcome on an individual basis. She then talks at the scale phase about that considered architect becoming the wise monarch. So you can see that there's very different profound changes that occur. I mean, it's quite interesting. I've spoken to Matt at Muse about this a number of times, and I think it's really interesting how much he mentioned. I mean, Muse is like 100 million of ARR, 600 or 700 people, extraordinary business, really dominating their category as the world's leading emerging property management system for hotels. And you know, I really missed that stage at the start phase when we did everything, myself and Richard Valter. We sold everything, we onboarded everybody. But then Greg Naidu stepped in together with a couple of other people to really bring Craig Bonifant, sorry, I can see it there, to bring real professionalization to the sales process and also to the customer success process. But as he said, he still misses those days. 5 pillars of success in the build phase, and I will be going into this in more detail on later presentations. 5 pillars of success in the build phase are these. This is not about saying every company is the same. Right? Every company we've ever invested in is different, and what will make a company extraordinarily successful will be unique. But nevertheless, we see when we look at the very successful companies that they know these 5 things really well. One is, I know inside out who my very best customers are. Not just my ICP and my TAM, but the sequence of segmentation, the sequence of segments, sorry, that I'm going to approach. If I know which segment is the very best segment for me to sell to, that will buy the most, that will buy the fastest, that will get the most success, that will drive the most advocacy, that will get me to my goal where I need to get to, wouldn't I just focus on that? When I'm nailing that segment, then I can start to look at the second and the third and the fourth. And we see the best companies do this. They know who their best customers are, and they point all their resources at them. The second thing they do is they understand the end-to-end customer journey. I remember one of the first sessions I did with Andy on this with one of our portfolio companies when he left. And he sat down with a company that was really in this kind of 3 to 4 million. And he said, okay, let's map out your customer journey from initial identification of an ideal customer all the way through to advocacy. Now let's break all of that down into a really kind of defined structure, if you like. And the best customers know that, best portfolio companies and the best CEOs know this. They know how to customer journey works from end to end. The second thing is, once I've done that and I've defined the various stages of that customer journey, then they underpin that with data that helps them to understand how well they're doing, both from a lead and a lag perspective. So how well is demand creation working? How well is, let's call it sales conversion, working? How well is customer success and realization working? And can I demonstrate my ability to constantly improve upon those, every aspect of the journey, with data and insight? The fourth thing they do is that they're really looking for standard inputs and standard processes to drive increasingly predictable outcomes. So they've professionalized and specialized every single element of that stage. They've underpinned everything with enablement. They've underpinned everything with capabilities and systems and data and tech to help the go-to-market function achieve predictable outcomes. And the last one is that they use all of those previous four to help them to plan and to forecast. Too many companies, possibly pushed by the VCs, let finance build the plan, and they work from the triple, triple, double, double, double. That's fine. We can be aspirational, but we've got to work from first principles. We have to work from a bottom up that says this is based upon the resources we have and the resources we plan to bring in, and the speed with which leads move through the life cycle, the speed with which we're able to expand revenue. This is what we can achieve. And during the typically 3 or 4 years of the build phase, my ability to plan and execute and optimize revenue is absolutely critical. And we might call that RevOps. Many people call it, have different names, but this is really profound. And I think within a couple of quotes here, one from me, for me, 10 million is the big break point. The company is starting to get in its own way. There's too much friction, systems not working, tech failing, process insufficient. Andy also points to the founder privilege, this notion that the founder can have a profound impact on our ability to win customers. It really has eroded completely at 10 million now. You need a professionalized and specialized customer lifecycle. Harrison Rose has been extraordinarily helpful to me and to us. He was one of the co-founders of Paddle. He led their commercial operations for a 10-year period. And he has this kind of insight for founders, is that it's not enough just to sell. You have to insert yourself into the life cycle at an atomic level. So I've really understood how every step of the process is working all the way down the line. It may not be you as the founder doing that work, but it's absolutely on you as the founder to ensure that work is being done. So now we're into the third stage, scale. And as you expect, and I guess you're starting to get the idea, things change again. So let's dig into that a little bit. The phrase of scaling and scalers is really important here, I think, because this is a fundamental shift from really focusing on the consistency into real predictable yield. This is a time when, we need to take a step back and look down at this kind of go-to-market engine and think of it like a machine. How is everything interconnected? And can we then hone and tune every aspect of the go-to-market function? We also, and I think this is a really interesting concept, again, slightly stolen from Frank Slootman in his book, Amp It Up, which is we need to start to push the limits. We need to find the edge to which we can take kind of our investment for growth. And he talks about moving from constrained to unconstrained resources, but really challenging ourselves. Okay, we've grown fast, but actually could we grow faster still? Talk a little bit more about that in a second. Complexity is increasing dramatically, as you would expect. We're launching new products. We're entering new markets. We've got to start to diversify our revenue and make sure our TAM is getting bigger and bigger. We'll be looking for organic and inorganic growth. We'll be looking to build extensive distribution and third-party and partner channels. We'll be really thinking about how we start to dominate our market. And we're doing all of this, winning those ideal customers, making them insanely successful at the same time as driving world-class unit economics, CAC payback growth, and net revenue retention. If we're to grow from 30 to 100, because as we mentioned at the beginning, we see a lot of companies slowing down in that time period. Changes abound across the team, and the teams are leveling up. Leaders are required across each functional area. The CEO has to be working on the business, but not in the business, looking up and out, bringing in layers of experienced managers. The product is becoming increasingly outcome-led, while the business is becoming increasingly customer-centric. And there's a nice quote here from Matt from Muse. At this stage, he talked about how much he loved the start phase and the importance of bringing professionalization and specialization in the build stage. But here, the watchword is focus. Everyone knows what we're doing and why we're doing it. Everyone knows their role, and everybody knows how they interrelate. But here's an interesting topic. There's an acceptance that growth naturally declines over time, and it certainly is harder to grow as faster as you get bigger. And there's a lot of kind of talk about growth persistence and growth degradation. I was picking on this data set from the Bessemer launched, I think it was last year, which looks at the SaaS cloud companies on their SaaS cloud index. And it looks at last year's growth against this year's growth. And they drew a correlation line, which shows 0.7x. Therefore, if I grow at 100% this year, I should assume it to be 30% less next year. And it's interesting because that does seem to make sense. But actually, when you look at this data, you can see real outliers here, and there really is no trend. Forecasting for growth for early stage cloud companies is incredibly hard. And we talked about just how important it is to get really good at this. But also there has to be an acceptance that next year's growth is not necessarily related to last year's growth. And more importantly, the other way around, the actions that drove growth one year might not necessarily drive growth the next year. Growth outcomes can go from good to bad and bad to good within a year. So I think the key thing here is no assumptions. Well, no assumption that growth has to slow down, but no assumptions that we're leaving anything to chance as well. And we really have to own our distribution and go-to-market strategy. And kind of set a new agenda when we're coming into the scale phase, that growth degradation is possibly a dangerous myth, because what it allows us to do is to assume that it can't get better. And that doesn't sit well with, I don't think, the majority of founders. Just because I'm growing at 100% next year shouldn't mean that I can only grow at 70% next year. Surely, as I get to scale, I can still find those opportunities for increased value, so I can increase the ACV, to bring in innovations to allow me to address an additional market segment, that there aren't opportunities for fine-tuning and optimization all the way along that SaaS funnel. This talks specifically to our ability to understand our growth model and the limits and constraints of that. The limits and constraints are not just the model, but the market, the people, the processes, the systems, and the tech. And thinking about that machine really in its component parts. looking at the lead and lag data, understanding what works, what doesn't, and then ensuring everything is resourced and managed. Pipeline and knowing where your revenue comes from quarters in advance is extremely important at this stage, as too is the ability to forecast. And as companies hit that kind of 100 million target, then they need to start to act like a public company might do. Meeting and beating quarterly forecasts is a critical core competency of running a public business. So 7 topics here. I think all the other ones I've had 5, but Pop's got a bit carried away. Andy quote on the right side, there's a lot to take in. Moving past 30 million at pace is no mean feat. And if you don't have a clear definition of your category, the problem you're solving, your ideal customer profile, you will fail. So kind of 7 topics here. I'll be going into these again in more detail in a later session, but number 1, we really know how to grow with predictable yield. We're starting to push the limits with green indicators across the customer lifecycle. We're insanely focused, to Matt's point, and we're very aligned. We know who our very best customers are, and we are obsessing about making them successful. We really own our distribution strategy. We know how this go-to-market machine works. We've really defined the industry we're creating, and we're on our way to dominating that, just like organizations like Muse and Go Cardless are. We're developing strategies for inorganic growth because, well, why wouldn't we, as a market leader, be thinking about the implications of acquiring people, product, or revenue? Because we do need to build revenue diversity. A key topic here, and I think I touched on this a little bit earlier in terms of, why might we see companies slowing down after 10 years, could be technical debt. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed, because if not, it will slow a business down substantially. Andy talks very eloquently about the importance of best-in-class systems, tech and data across front and back office. And, forecasts that are credible, pipeline coverage is strong, and organizations that know where their revenue are coming from years, maybe years is a bit much, quarters in advance. There's I love this quote from Nick Mehta. I touched on the point about technical debt. Product strategy is changing too, and that's no mean undertaking. Engineering teams are dealing with large multiple product teams, so maintaining focus on vision is challenging. Technical debt's got to be addressed. And Nick kind of put this really well to me. He said, I think of our product as the ship of Theseus. And for those of you who don't know, it's a Greek mythological story about the ship that sails around the world, and everything on the ship has been replaced, but it's still the same ship. Gainsight is on the 3rd complete rebuild, but it's still the same product. And largely the same could be said for the business. And I think that's the whole point of this start, build, scale. You're effectively leading and a different 3 different businesses as you go through that journey. So just kind of wrapping it up. In summary, the single most important message from this whole topic that we're going to be doubling down on is that you need to understand your stage. You need to understand where you are, start, build, or scale. And the revenue milestones between that, there's the 1s and 3s that we talked about. And you need to understand your readiness to move from one stage to the next. Second is that you've got to focus on the first principles that underpin success at each of those stages, starting, building, and scaling. More of a general topic, kind of consciously limit your options and narrow your focus. I mean, Matt Weller talked about it at the scale stage. This is critical at any stage. Don't I always want my very best resources pointed at my very best customers? A topic we're going to be covering in more detail in the next section is about eradicating mistakes. I talked about it a little bit in the previous one. We know the things on a personal basis that if we didn't do them, our lives would be quite a lot better. They're not necessarily easy to avoid, but we tend to know what they are. And I think the same is true of businesses. And we're going to be breaking the mistakes down into start, build, and scale. And then the last one, and we'll be covering more about the people challenges along the way, because that is the single most important thing you can do. When you think about success as an individual in the life you lead, the most important thing is the people you surround yourself with. And that is so true within business context as well. And so thinking of your starters, your builders, and your scalers, thinking about people who are 9s and 10s out of 10 in each of those contexts, and putting the right people in the right roles at the right time with repeat pedigree to really help you on that journey. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and if you're interested in digging into this in more detail, you can find the resources on the website of this session and the previous and the ones to come in the very near future. Thank you very much.